Hey there, dirt bike people. I'm Chuck from TrueTech, and today I'm going to be taking the power valve assembly out of this cylinder, TPI 300, and putting it into this one.
Now you can take this thing apart in almost any order. It really doesn't matter. On this particular day, I decided to take the flange off first. I often do it that way. This is a spare cylinder that I have, and it's missing one of the pipe spring mounts. I'll show you where that goes later. There's some sealant holding this flange on, so you often have to pry it up a little bit. Next, I'm taking off this little retaining plate with these two screws. These two little Torx heads are pretty sensitive. Make sure that you have a good sharp Torx bit. Next is this little arm, and it can also be really tight. Whenever you're working with one of these power valves, it's always a good idea to keep the left stuff on the left and the right stuff on the right. Now the sub-exhaust valve on the left-hand side can come out. It has a little L stamped in it, and we can pull out these little O-rings. Now the right side disassembly is very similar to the left. We can pull out this main M6 bolt, and when you do that, you'll notice that the spring suddenly pops out of its place. That's totally fine. And you can remove this whole mechanism as one assembly. Now there's no need to take this apart, but in case you do, we'll go over that in a minute. Now this little plate can come off, and then same as the other side, this little retainer and these two bolts can come out. Then the little barrel on the right hand side, and then we can pull the main exhaust flap out. It's often a little bit stuck, so you might need to pry it a little bit. If you're sending your cylinder out for Nicosil, you'll need to remove this transmission vent. I'm going to be swapping it over the other cylinder, so I'm taking it off anyway. Now back to this little arm here. So if you pop this bolt out, you'll get the washer. The purpose of that washer is to center the spring, and then the spring obviously will come with it as well. Now if we look at the back side of this, there's this little collar, and this is the part that most often gets installed incorrectly. If this collar doesn't slide into this little plate, then the power valve mechanism will get bound up and it won't move properly. Now this little bolt that's left, you don't want to take that out. If you've taken it out, you need to reset your Z or Z dimension, and the dimension depends on whether you have a 250 or a 300. There are a couple of tricks to installing this, but for now we'll just put it back together the way that we took it apart. Both of these little sleeves can come off, and then we can pull the O-rings out of their grooves. Now it's time to get all this stuff cleaned up for reassembly. I like to soak everything in this carb cleaner, and that softens all of the carbon deposits. If you let it soak long enough, the carb cleaner itself will do a good job if you use a good quality cleaner like this. But I usually get impatient and I finish it with my wire wheel or a wire brush. Ta-da! That's what it should look like when it's all done. If you're using a wire wheel or a wire brush, just be gentle. It's made of aluminum. So now we can put these new O-rings back on, and a little two-stroke oil doesn't hurt either. Now before you drop this into the cylinder, it's important to make sure that it moves smoothly. Sometimes, especially when you get new Nicosil, there's a bit of roughness up here and you got to file it away. Now once you've made sure that this sealing surface is clean, you can go ahead and put the coolant O-rings back in. Now in my situation, I'm swapping exhaust flanges, so this screw has to come out and be put in the new one. So I'm just going to loosen off this lock nut, and then I can pull the set screw out. Now while I'm here, I'm definitely going to address the super common TPI oil leak. The leak is caused by transmission oil traveling between the threads of the screw and the threads of the exhaust flange. All that's needed is to put a little bit of thread sealant in there. I just spread it around with a dental pick like this, and then the screw's ready to go in. Now we're going to need to set the position of this screw a little bit later, so if you're not going to do the rest of the procedure very quickly, then I would recommend waiting to put the thread sealant on until a little bit later. This joint requires some liquid gasket maker, and KTM recommends Loctite 5910. I definitely agree with Loctite 5910, but here I'm using a 3-bond product. Whatever the case, you need to make sure that it's resistant to heat and to petroleum products. You don't need much, but you want to apply a thin, even layer. Take a look at the position in which I put the little washers that hold the springs for the exhaust. They need to go in this location and similar to this orientation. Now as you tighten these bolts down, you need to make sure to put your hand inside the cylinder and lift the power valve all the way up. If it's down, it's going to push the power valve against the Nicosil and it's going to break the cylinder. The torque on these bolts is 8 Newton meters or 6 foot-pounds. Now these little barrels are ready to go in. New O-ring of course and a bit of 2-stroke oil. And then we're ready to do this little plate. When Loctiting a bolt that goes into a blind hole, it's important to put the Loctite into the hole so that the air pressure built up from putting the screw into the hole doesn't push the Loctite out instead of allowing it to coat the threads. The torque on these little bolts is 6 Newton meters or 4.5 foot-pounds. Now we can install this little plate, little Loctite in the hole, and when we install this little assembly, we want to tighten the bolt down only about halfway. Then you want to grab the short end of the spring and pull it over this little knob. Now you need to make very sure that the ends of the springs are on opposite sides of the knobs, just like this. Then we can tighten down this bolt to 10 Newton meters or 7.5 foot-pounds. Now we're going to set what's known as the Z dimension, or the Z dimension if you're in the States. Spec for a 250 is 49 millimeters, and the spec for a 300 is 49.5 millimeters. We're going to measure from the top of the cylinder to the bottom of the power valve when it's fully closed. I'm going to drop my vernier down into the cylinder like this and feel for the bottom of it with my finger. There is a special tool for this, but I don't own it, and this works just fine. Make the necessary adjustments and then lock the nut to 8 Newton meters or 6 foot-pounds. This cylinder is from a 2019 or older KTM 250 or 300. The primary difference between these cylinders is simply the Z dimension adjustment, which is right here. Besides this adjustment, the power valve procedure is pretty much the same. Now we can go ahead and install the left side of the power valve, basically the same as the right hand side. We put this little barrel in, the retainer, and then the plate. There's no spring mechanism on this side, it's just a bit of Loctite. Tighten up the bolt to 10 Newton meters or 7.5 foot-pounds, install the transmission vent, and the assembly is complete. Now there's one really important check to do here. I'm doing it with a ring. I'm just sliding the ring down into the bore, and then I'm going to operate the power valve back and forth to make sure that the power valve clears the ring. You can also do this with a straight edge through the bore. If you want to see more videos like this, subscribe and hit the notification bell.